is a visual artist. Diane Lechleitner is a visual artist, poet, and author. She studied fine arts at the Pratt Institute, where she received a BFA in printmaking. Her art career is unique and impressive as she is. Her artwork has been represented in juried exhibitions, including the Print Center in Philadelphia and the Dade College Gallery in Miami, where her work remains in the permanent collection. Diane is also the winner of an Exxon Award for printmaking and has received several artists in residence fellowships. Diane's debut novel, Farron Goss, is a winner of the Forward Review's Indies General Fiction Award and the National Indie Excellent Award, is a notable book, Shelf Unbound Best Indie Book Competition, received a Royal Dragonfly Book Award honorable mention, and was a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Da Vinci I Award, as well as being nominated for the Indie Next list. Her poems and short stories have appeared in numerous literary journals, both online and in print. According to the Midwest Book Review, readers looking for a poetic, evocative description of coming of age in a Maine lobstering community will find Farron Goss a lovely literary piece that comes full circle into love. We are excited to welcome Sleepy Hollow's Diane Lechleitner.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to everyone who came here today. My novel, Farron Goss, is a coming-of-age story about a boy who lives on an island in the Gulf of Maine. He's a little different, but the cast of characters in his community take good care of him. I wasn't sure where to start in this book, but I finally decided I'd just start at the beginning. So I'm going to read bits and pieces from about the first 3 chapters. To the men on the island, Allison Goss was an intriguing, raw-boned beauty. To the women, she was a dark, willowy threat. So when she fell overboard and drowned on a calm, sunny afternoon in July, only some of the islanders cared. No one even knew she was missing until the next morning, when Myron Sprague checked his lobster traps and found her dinghy tangled in one of his sets, still held fast by an oar mounted in the brass lock. Not long after, Allison herself drifted into Gallagher's boatyard and got wedged between the pilings at low tide. Hodie Ebel, the harbor master, found the body. It was all fouled in seaweed. Crabs and gulls had pulled and pecked at the bloated corpse. The eyes were gone, sockets cleaner than crow-pick roadkill. Hodie tugged at his scraggly beard, a nervous habit, and then went inside to find Jerry Gallagher. Jerry was bent over a case of snaps and shackles, cursing. "What's wrong?" asked Hodie. They sent the wrong stuff." Jerry pushed his stringy blonde hair out of his face and glared at Hodie. "Need something?" "Yeah, I have to use your phone." Jerry listened as Hodie called the sheriff to report the gruesome discovery. "Come on," Hodie said when he hung up. "It's a 2-man job." They went outside and snagged Allison with boat hooks, dragged her up the ramp into the parking lot, covered her with a blue vinyl tarp, and went for an early lunch at Scuppers. Scuppers is one of 2 restaurants on the island. It's the first wind-blown building you come to when you get off the ferry at Sheepscott Road. Red Sedgwick bought the place when he gave up cod fishing 23 years ago, then a young man and already disgusted with fish politics. An antique duckpin alley remains intact, along with the original lunch counter, which now doubles as a bar. Red's most recent concession to modern times was making the restaurant one of the few non-smoking areas on the island. After years of breathing cigarette smoke and grease fumes, something had to go. His no smoking rule got people all riled up and caused an indignation meeting over at the school one evening, but he stuck to his guns. If you want to eat at Scuppers, you can't light up. In addition to the 14 stools at the bar, there are 16 tables, 17 if you count the small one under the dartboard. The place is always packed to the gills, and today was no different. Jerry got the last stool at the bar, and Hody squeezed in next to him, standing sideways with his elbow on the dark mahogany. After ordering a beer and swallowing the first bite of a greasy double cheeseburger, Hody told everyone that Allison Goss floated into Gallagher's yard, and he and Jerry pulled her out of the water and left her lying on the gravel lot. The lunch crowd looked at him. Their mouths were open, but no words came out. What? Someone finally asked. Everyone had heard about Myron finding Allison's empty boat earlier that morning, but this latest news came as a shock. Red poured both men another beer. You sure it's her? He wiped his hands on his apron and leaned on the bar. Of course we're sure, Hody said. I figure that rattletrap of hers must have broke down again, so she was rowing across the cove, maybe for her weekly shopping, stood up, for God knows what reason, and fell over the side. She couldn't swim a stroke, and she had no business being out alone in the boat in the first place. But try and tell her that. Hell, try and tell her anything. Jerry and the other men at the bar agreed with Hody's version of the gruesome event, but a brash bunch of fishermen's wives, sitting together in their usual lunchtime spot, assumed Allison had been going across the cove to meet Kate Sawyer's husband, Brad. She probably didn't want anyone to see her jalopy sitting out front, so she went by boat, the sneak, one of the green-eyed wives sneered. She was always fooling around with someone else's man. Whatever happened, it served her right. The men didn't say too much more after that. Certainly not that deep down, they wished it had been them, not Brad Sawyer, that Allison had drowned over. More than a few of them would secretly miss the possibilities that only existed when Allison was around. Menhaden Island is named after a fish, a 12-inch long, algae-eating, shiny blue baitfish, better known as a pogie. They aren't as plentiful as they used to be, but the old-timers remember when the Gulf of Maine teemed with them. On sunny, flatwater days, the shimmering fish could be seen rippling the surface of the ocean as they rose from the depths in huge dark blue schools. Menhaden's a tight-knit community of think-alikes, lobstermen mostly, and the peevish women who marry them. There are barely enough children on the island to fill up the schoolhouse. Once they're grown, most of them leave for the mainland to work at desk jobs in the shadows of the old fish canneries, where their grandmothers used to punch a clock and pack herring. Most who stay make their living from the sea. All told, the native islanders are a small bunch whose number keeps dwindling, just like the fish their island was named for. Heavy weather and an 8-mile stretch of water sets them apart from the rest of the world, and that suits them just fine. Regardless of what people thought of Allison, they did pull together to give her a proper church burial after she drowned. She was, they reckoned, an islander and deserved a decent funeral. The service was brief, and half the congregation came late, just in time for the coffee and cake afterwards. But as they milled around, speaking in hushed voices, they did their best to keep ungracious words at bay. In the spirit of burying the bad with the bones, they tried to find something good to say about Allison Goss, because after all, she never really had a chance. And somewhere in their weathered hearts, her fellow islanders knew that. And of course, there was the boy. The afternoon coffee clutches were abuzz after Farron was born. Someone on Menhaden was his father. And if that someone was a married man, it meant his wife was cooking dinner every night for a cheating husband. But the wives knew better than to point fingers, since it might well be any one of them doing the cooking. They had it all figured out mathematically. Farron was born at the end of January. That meant he was conceived in April or May, and there weren't any summer people on the island yet. There were a few strangers coming and going on the ferry that spring, sizing up Menhaden as a possible vacation spot, but none stayed long enough to get to know Allison. Whoever fathered the child had to be a local, no doubt about it. And as Farron grew from an infant to a boy, the island wives kept him at a distance, worried that if they looked too closely, they might see their husband's grin flash across his face. Farron was beautiful to look at, just like his mother, a lithe, winsome eyeful. But at a young age, he began showing signs of being as troubled as she was. It was a year after his mother died when Clayton Jewett saw him running shirtless and barefoot through a field of bees. "It was the craziest thing I ever saw," Clayton exclaimed later. "I went out to my field to look at the hives, and I saw this small boy running through my clover. I shouted to him, but he ran off into the trees with a swarm of bees chasing him. And I'm not sure, but I swear I heard that boy laughing. Why, that's the strangest thing," I thought. But then when I realized it was Allison Goss's kid, well, it didn't seem so strange anymore. Farron ditched the bees by jumping into a shallow cow pond and holding his head underwater. When Clayton finally caught up with him, he dragged the dripping kid into his pickup and drove him to see Dr. Owen Batch. Farron's feet and legs swelled up like ticks on a dog's ear. "Why did you do it?" Doc Batch asked the swollen boy. "I wanted to see if the buzzing was louder than the stings." "Louder than the stings?" The doctor was bewildered. "What do you mean? Stings aren't loud." "They are to me." Farron put his hand over his mouth and wouldn't say another word. Farron bussed tables, washed dishes, cleaned fish, and did whatever else Red needed. It may not have been the social life the Gages had in mind, but it was better than nothing. Got him around people, and he seemed to like it. So much so that he kept the job at Scuppers all through high school. On weekends, he got up early and worked the breakfast shift. During his break, he liked to sit with the same group of stout wives who came in for coffee and gossip every Saturday morning. They never actually invited him to join them. He just eased his way to the end of their table, and since he turned out to be the spitting image of Allison Goss and not any of their husbands, they let him stay. As small as the island school was, students managed to create cliques, and Farron had a hard time fitting in, except with the girls. At 16, he looked older than his age, and his dark eyes and long, lean limbs were the cause of many schoolgirl crushes. When girls chased after him, the other boys were jealous. "You shouldn't talk to him," they said. "He's weird. All he does is catch butterflies and draw bugs. His whole family was crazy." But the girls didn't listen. Although Farron was shy, his love-struck admirers were bold. They passed him notes in class. In the hallways, they clamored for a whiff of him. The braver ones arranged to meet him after school, hoping he'd kiss them in the deep shadows of covering pines. Sometimes they sneaked away to their father's snugged up boats after dark, wanting him to pin them down on fish-stained decks, longing to feel the weight of him. But it was more than his dazzling good looks that attracted them. They were fascinated by the magical way he made insects come to life with a pencil, making them even more beautiful than they actually were. And secretly, the girls wished he might do the same for them. They swarmed around him while he sketched, posing themselves in ways they hoped might catch his eye. The summer after graduating high school, Farron kept a full-time job at Scuppers, where he traded bits of conversation with the shapely female summer residents who sought him out when they came into the restaurant under the pretense of ordering one of Red's fatty fried meals, which clearly wasn't part of their usual diet. They were well-tended women, Preble pretties, the locals called them, on the island alone with their children and nannies during the week, while the husbands worked on the mainland. It wasn't unusual to see them saunter into Scuppers during Farron's shift. "Will you look at that?" Brad Sawyer complained to Alden one day. They were both sitting out a sun shower at Scuppers eating lunch at the bar. Brad lifted his wrist an inch off his soup-stained placemat and flicked it towards two evenly tanned women who were vying for Farron's attention. they know they're old enough to be that kid's mother. He did a double take. Hell, maybe even grandmother. Ain't that the limit? Brad, Alden said, if there's one thing I've learned after all these years, it's that a lot of folks on this island don't pay any attention to limits. Not speed limits, not alcohol limits, and not age limits. Yeah, still, it ain't right. Alden couldn't help himself. Things have reversed. What's that supposed to mean? Alden slid backwards off the stool and stood up. He picked up his coffee cup and finished the sweet dregs at the bottom. It means that this time it's the husbands with a case of green-eyed envy, not the wives. Speak for yourself. Alden laughed. I'm not married. He slapped Brad on the back. See you later. Alden hiked up his wide leather gun belt and headed toward the door, tipping his hat to Red. Thanks for lunch, Red. On the way out, he gave a sidelong glance toward Farron, who, in the rain-washed sunlight that streamed through the windows, looked just like his mother.
Thank you, Diane. Christopher Fryer is co-author of Jack Nicholson, The Early Years, the only book about the Oscar-winning actor in which Nicholson participated. Fryer also co-authored Bruce Dern's memoir, Things I've Said But Probably Shouldn't Have, and Crane, Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unsolved Murder, with Robert Crane, a memoir by the son of slain Hogan's Heroes star, Bob Crane. Chris has contributed to many publications, including Condé Nast Traveler, Playboy, and the New York Times, and is also a contributor to Hal Ashby Interviews. Hunting License is Chris's story in the anthology Beyond Where Buses Run, which was just published by Oregon Greystone Press, and is his first published work of fiction. Please help me welcome Cornwall's Christopher Fryer.
Thanks, Christina. This is the aforementioned anthology, Beyond Where the Buses Run. The story that appears in here, it's called Hunting License, and I won't be reading that today because time constraints, it's a little long to read from. So I'll be reading another story, also about a misfit, so to speak, called The Course. I seen Herr Corson once as a boy back home. I remember the old boys crowded around Delbert's pickup talking about how fast the dogs was, how they loved seeing them run flat out. I know for certain most of them dogs was faster than old Delbert's pickup truck. The course was just an excuse for a lot of bottle passing and wagering, but all the while there was this sad old hare sitting in a cage in the rusted bed of the pickup. He pushed himself against the wire of the cage so his fur was sticking out, and he twitched his nose mightily, trying to get a scent of what all the hollering was about. Little did he know. I petted him through the holes in the cage, and he felt smooth and warm as flannel. He sat real still, so I guessed he liked the petting well enough. Pettis growled at me, saying, "Keep your fingers out of there, boy, else he's likely to think they's carrots and chop them clean off." I paid him no mind. Pa said Pettis was simple. I kept stroking the hare's ears. They felt like my ma's special nightgown, the one Pa gave her for Christmas, but that I never seen her wear. When I was little, I used to sneak into her room sometimes and feel it in her bureau drawer. As I stroked the hare's long ears, I watched the thin veins in them wiggling like lines on a road map. I wondered what all the yelling and belching and backslapping sounded like in those ears. I guessed he was just trying to figure out them dogs, yapping away and spinning on their leads like whirligigs. Before too long, the shouting stopped. The dogs got quiet, but you knew they was hot. The hare hopped back and forth across the cage, leaving his little shits on the cardboard floor. He must have known he was safe as long as there was all that squabbling. But now that it was quiet, he had a feeling there was going to be trouble. He was going to be part of it. Pettis carried the cage from the truck over to the field. It was one of those fields lying fallow, only weeds and clods the size of melons growing there. The men took their dogs and made a kind of U shape with Pettis and the hare standing in the middle. The dogs got to howling like to pull the soul out of that dead earth. Pettis's dirty hand opened the cage and he kicked it so as to give that hare a start. He was no fool, though, that old hare. He jumped out of the cage and stopped, just sat there a moment, surveying the situation. He must have known that what they wanted him to do was run, because he didn't. He just sat, twitching that nose, using them ears, deciphering all the yelling, barking from man and dog. He took one hop. The men started heaving dirt clods at him. He just hopped to avoid the spray of dust. How'd he know not to run, I wondered. Maybe that nose of his picked up the smell of death in the air. Lord knows it was heavy in the breeze that was whipping up the little dust devils across the horizon. I could almost smell it myself, in the sweat of those men and the drool of those dogs and the mean, hot breath of Pettis. When the preacher talked about the sickening stink of hell, I always thought of Pettis's breath. It gave me the creeps. And likely as not, it was Pettis's breath, as much as the fear of God, that kept me from being a bigger sinner than I am. "Where'd you get that hare, Pettis?" Turley yelled. "I seen three-legged cows move better than that." The men laughed and Pettis grew red as sin, standing there with a hare that wouldn't run. It was dangerous to get Pettis hot, because likely as not, he'd do something that would draw blood as a result. Pettis walked over to that hare, puffing as he did as he walked. The hare hopped a couple of hops, first this way, then that, just enough to get Pettis bending and dipping like one of those toys they sell at the Midway that bob up and down into a glass of water. The men were howling so hard they had to fold their arms across their stomachs. Pettis finally snatched that hare by the ears, chucked him across the field. I thought for sure when he landed in a gasp of dust, he was dead. But he rolled over and over, came up twitching his nose, yearning to get his senses right. "Get him!" Pettis yelled as he loosed his dog, a big, ugly hound with chewed up ears and breath near as bad as Pettis's. The dog lit out. The others all let theirs go too. The hare, hearing all that wildness coming down on him, decided that he had to make a run for it. But like I said before, he was smart. Not only smart, but brave as any man I've seen before or since. He spun around, watching those dogs coming at him from all angles, and waited. He waited until I'm sure he could smell their breath. Just as those jaws started to snap on him, that hare took off like nothing flat, and those dogs just crashed into one another like one big heap of meanness. Man, could that old hare run. It was a sight. Before those dogs could recover their feet, he was on his way to freedom. Now, I remember the preacher talking about how death won't be denied. And I guess that was just the case that day, because as the hare was disappearing, Pettis tore out in his truck and cut him off. So he had to double back toward the dogs, who were barreling after him, lathered in their own hate and embarrassment. The hare zigzagged through those dogs in a way that just whipped them on. That old hare was righteous in his speed. He moved like wind through leaves, but every time the dust cleared for him to see the horizon, Pettis pulled his truck ahead. The dogs leapfrogged each other every time that hare made a turn, but that hare, he was showing them dogs that he was best, even if they did kill him, which they did. They buried him in a cloud of dust as each one tried to tear a piece of respect from that old hare's hide. The men ran out, hooting about whose dog got the first licks, and I watched them pull what was left of that hare out of those bloody, wild mouths. It was just a sorry little sack of fur, brown and red. Pettis twisted off the hind foot and threw it at me. "Here you go, boy. Here's a lucky charm." My paw dried that foot out and stuffed it for me. I carry it in my pocket still. I keep it to remind myself what courage is. Now, the whole reason I'm telling this story is on account of what I seen the other night. I live in the city now, and there ain't much in the way of open land around here. Just a lot of glass and bricks and buildings so tall that they glitter like stars at night, which is good because I ain't seen any stars since I moved here. I was walking down the street. It was one of those streets with shops that close up like armadillos, their armor pulled down tight around their middles. A white-haired man and a lady was walking in front of me, and I started to go around them. Well, as I did that, the woman let out a yelp, and as I swung around, she screamed, "He took my purse!" Running off the other way, as fast as any human I've ever seen run, was a boy in high-top sneakers. Well, the old guy with the lady, he lit out after, but it was a sure bet he'd never catch anything but cold, slipping and clicking in his street shoes. So without thinking, I just took up the chase myself. We was yelling at people up the block to stop that boy, and pretty soon there was a pack of folks on the hunt. The boy zigzagged through parked and moving cars, back and forth across the street, and seeing his way blocked, he doubled back at us. I still ain't sure what I'd have done if he got to me, because a man came out of nowhere and tackled that boy with a thud on the pavement. As he fell, he flung the purse into the street. I went over and picked it up, gave it to the lady. As the mob that was chasing him gathered round, the old guy was white as paste. My wallet's gone, the lady said. Her hands were shaking. The old guy went over and sat on the hood of a parked car. He looked real bad. "Where's the wallet?" asked the man holding the boy down. "I didn't see no wallet," he said. "Where's the wallet, crumb bum?" said a fat guy who was part of the pack. He reminded me of Pettis with his gray teeth. The boy just stared into the cement. Wasn't much else he could do, laying there spread eagle like he was. The fat man walked over and stood right on that boy's hand. "You gonna say what you did with the wallet, or am I gonna break your hand?" Fat man said. He put some of his weight on it, and that boy's knuckles popped like pine cones in a hot fire. "Anyone call the cops?" the man that done the tackling asked. "We don't need no cops," fat man said. "Here's the wallet," another man yelled from across the street. He ran it over to the lady. "Everything in it?" Why, yes, I think so," she said, looking it over. "Thank you." The old guy was shaking now. "Didn't see the wallet, huh?" said the fat man. The boy just kept staring hard into the night. I could tell he was thinking about freedom. "Let me hold him," the fat man said. He let the other guy up while putting his knee in the middle of the boy's back. The kid yelped. "Don't like it, huh, stupid punk?" The fat man glowed. "Maybe next time you ought to think twice before you snatch a purse in this neighborhood." He leaned on the boy's back. The crowd was getting hot watching that boy's pain, and they started yelling and calling him names. He just laid there, quiet, feeling his hurt. Then, with a move that was quicker than spit, that boy flipped over and kicked that fat man square in the jewels. He let out a howl that could have stopped Christmas. But before that boy could get himself free, the crowd was on him. There was no stopping him. Feet and fists were flying, and there was something about the anger in those folks that chilled my bones. It wasn't just that boy they was beating for snatching a purse. He was getting beat for every injustice those folks felt living in a foul and heartless city. Back on that field, it was grace and beauty that was being whooped for being just that. But here, it was real forces of evil doing battle. A police car came screaming the wrong way down the one-way street. It squealed to a stop. The officers got out slowly with their billy clubs ready. They looked like they wouldn't mind inflicting a little hurt themselves. Okay, break it up here." He twirled that stick like a gunslinger. The crowd stepped back. The boy was lying on the ground, his eyes all puffed, and it looked like he'd done the bleeding for everyone. "So what's the story here?" the officer asked. Everybody started yelling at once. All right, knock it off. You, the officer said, pointing his stick at me. I felt like a spotlighted buck. You see what had transpired here? He waited. You gonna speak or we gonna play charades? He made a face at his partner and the crowd laughed. I felt my face going red. Well, officer, this man, I said, pointing to the boy still on the ground. I seen him take this lady's handbag. And this man, I said, pointing to the guy that tackled him, stopped him. But this man, I said, pointing to the fat man, he's the one that started all the beating. Why, you stupid Okie, the fat man said in a shower of spit. I could see there was plenty of hate left in him. Sarge, this friggin' punk kicked me in the nuts trying to escape. He was trying to escape because you was breaking his back, I heard myself say. Who is this friggin' crumbum? The fat man said. I'm going to take care of you later, he said to me. I could smell Pettis's breath. Take it easy. You've taken care of enough, the officer said. He turned to the lady clutching her purse. Anything missing? She shook her head. You want to press charges? I don't know, she said. She looked at her husband, still leaning on the car. Look, lady, let me tell you something. You press charges, we go downtown. He gets booked, printed, bailed, and he's on his way. You got to fill out forms in triplicate, be interviewed, lose time from work, sit through lineups, court, the whole three rings. You want to do that? She looked at her husband, who shook his head. No, I guess not. I guess not, since I didn't lose anything. Okay, then. All right, folks, show's over. On your way. The officer said as he moved through the crowd. He poked the boy in the ribs with his stick. You walk. The boy struggled to his feet. His eyes were slits. Blood still oozed from his lip. On your way before we cite you for littering. What if I want to press charges? The boy mumbled. What are you, a comedian? Get out of here, cop said. The boy limped off down the street, holding his side. The people rode him off with hoots and laughter, fat man loudest among them. I walked the other way into the city's starlight, put my hand in my pocket. I could feel that old hare's foot and thought, he was the lucky one.
So thanks to Diane and to Chris for their time reading today. In a moment, we'll take questions both from in-person audience as well as our Zoom audience. For the people out there in Zoom land, you can put your question in the chat and my colleague Natalie will get that question here to us and we'll have it answered. I also wanted to share for the folks here in person, Diane and Chris have their works available here for sale if anyone is interested. For our folks out in Zoom land, we will put the links for their purchase in the chat. And also tomorrow we'll follow up with an email, both with the YouTube link if you want to see this again or share it with friends, as well as in that email, there will be purchase information if you want to support these authors with their books, with a book purchase, I should say. So thank you so much. And now my question to our in-person audience is if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to bring the authors up and have them answered. Do we have any questions here? I do. Oh, yes.
Better hurry up.
Diane started to formulate the novel. How did it come along, and did you have an end result for it, or it kind of went along? It became where you wanted it to be.
So the question, and Diane, I'm going to ask you to come up so that we can speak into the microphone for all of our friends who are not with us. The question is what your process was in terms of your plan for the novel, the roadmap, as it were, from start to finish. Let me give you some space.
I was afraid someone would ask that question.
I just wanted to know how you got started on it, or what you
Yeah.
thought for and why you got going.
Yeah, it's well, It was a long process from start to finish. It took about 10 years to finish the book. And most of that wasn't writing. And a good chunk of that, probably at least 5 years, it was in a box, the manuscript, the first draft. So, and the book, I had started with short stories. I was just doing it for myself, just for fun, in between work and everything else. And I ended up trying to get some of those published. I got a few stories published. And eventually I thought, maybe I should try to write a book.
Yeah.
But I had no idea how to start one or what it would be about. So I went to my stack of short stories and I looked through them and I found one that I thought I could do something with. So it began with a short story that I think was about 20 pages long. You won't find much of that story in here now after all the revisions, but that's where I started. And I had no idea where it was going. I've read that writers are supposed to make outlines and have a plan, and I didn't have any of that. I just sort of went along whenever I had time off of work, my day job, to write if I felt like it. And the first draft was really very rough, and that's what sat in the box for many years. And it wasn't until I took it out and started the first revision and then subsequent ones that the story started coming together. I had what seemed like all these little short stories, all these scenarios. I wasn't quite sure how to fit them together. And I went through the whole thing. I'm sure other readers do too, where you lay it all out on the floor and try and piece it together. And
It's almost like a storyboard.
like a storyboard, but without the computer or, I mean, really on the floor. And the beds and every possible counter surface. So that's how it happened. And yeah, and it came out very different from all the early revisions.
Is there a reason why you set it in Maine? And this island that you refer to, Manhattan Island, real or imaginary place?
Thank you.
So the question is, I'm sorry, is there a reason it's set in Maine, and is this place real or imaginary?
Well, it's real to me, as are all the characters in this book. Did they hear me? Oh, okay. So it's real to me, but in fact, it's a fictitious island that I made up. Why in Maine? I love Maine. I have roots in Maine that go way back. My maternal grandparents lived on an island, sort of mid-coast. And as a very young child, baby, actually, and sometimes after that, I stayed with them. So I don't have very early memories because I was a little kid, but I found as I've gotten older, it's in my blood or something. And certainly we went back to the island to see my grandparents all through my childhood till I was an adult, until they passed away. So I have a strong connection, and I just something about the Maine coast. I wanted to, and I hope I did in this book, capture a very strong sense of place. And the book doesn't have a rollicking plot where something happens every chapter and anything crazy you can imagine is happening to the characters. But it does have likable, believable characters, but mostly I focused on a sense of place. So because of my love for Maine, and I pulled on some of my, a couple little vignettes that I did remember. But does that answer? Yeah, thank you.
I found reading it, that definitely was that you felt you were right there in Maine. I mean, I spent some time on Mohegan Island, which I kind of conveyed that's about where you were. I could sense when I've been there vacationing, it just gave you that whole feeling of scuppers. I could feel myself sitting on the stool. I could feel myself.
That's great.
I could feel it. And it really was very descriptive in that way.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much.
would you perhaps want to take a seat while I ask
Sure.
Mr. Fryer a question? Because I
Do I
believe
go behind?
you can sit right
Oh,
there if you don't mind. So I have a question for Mr. Fryer, and then I have a question for both of you, but let's bring Chris up here. You've written fiction, nonfiction, reportage, Q&A interview, and fiction. What do you enjoy about each style and format? What is the most challenging about each style and format?
Well, the big difference is that when you're writing fiction, it's coming from another place. I think it was Hemingway in Movable Feast. He talks about writing one true sentence. And I think what he meant by that was that you have to write an emotional truth, not necessarily a literal truth, but an emotional truth. And when I sit down to write fiction, I'm trying to convey something that seems true to me. Writing nonfiction is much more of a construction. It's like Legos, if you will. You put it together. A good friend of mine, my best friend from 60 years, Robert Crane, who's also a contributor to Beyond Where the Buses Run, he has a story in here as well. And he and I have written a couple of books together. And when we were doing, writing Bruce Dern's memoir, Bruce rambles. He's a real storyteller, as you might imagine if you've ever seen him act. And he just kind of goes wherever his stories take him. And when you sit with him for 50, 60 hours hearing stories, it becomes a jigsaw puzzle of how to put it together. And just as Diane mentioned when she was working, with all her short stories and putting them together, Bob and I literally took these stories of Bruce's and cut them into pieces and laid them out and then put them together to try and make a coherent narrative for his story, for Bruce's story. And that was how we did that. So it's a completely different challenge to try and put something like that together. And with writing an essay or writing a nonfiction piece, you have to get a framework. So you've set parameters for yourself in the course of the work, and very different from fiction. So.
I'm going to call you back up, actually. A question about the story that you read. Which of the characters, human or animal, did you relate to the most, and why?
Well, I should say right off the bat that no animals were harmed in the writing of this story. I've lived in the Hudson Valley now for a long time, 30 some odd years. And, but I come from this little backwater that you've probably never heard of. It's called Los Angeles. And I've never seen hair coursing. It's not something that's in my realm of experience. What triggered this story was the single incident of seeing a purse snatched on West 46th Street at 11 o'clock at night. And the kid snatched the purse and ran off. And that's the only bit of this that's true. That's the one true sentence, literally. So I guess I identify with the narrator. But in my heart of hearts, I identify with the hair. So I don't know what that says about me, but you're always struggling against the tide, I think. So what I identify with is the emotion and the sentiment behind the story that the narrator's telling.
So now we're being asked for Diane Does your knowledge of commercial fishing come from personal experience, exposure to commercial fishermen and from fisherwomen, or research, or a combination?
Let's see, my knowledge of boating comes from my husband, Doug, who's a lifelong sailor. And I'm a reluctant sailor, but I go. Uh, The other stuff, some of it, I'm not sure where it came from, but I did research. I researched lobsters and didn't want to eat another one after I read about those poor things either. So, but that's another story. But I researched that and lobster fishing. One time up in Maine, I went out with a lobsterman. I got up early one morning, went down to the wharf, and they invited me out. I watched the bait come in off the trucks, so I knew about the bait rooms, and that was all really great fun. I don't want to give away too much of the book, but there's a scene in the book about a fire on a boat, and one day I went up to Booth Bay Harbor, Maine, when I was researching the book, and I stopped unannounced into the Coast Guard station that's there. And there was a very nice officer there named Charles, and he agreed to see me. So we spent quite a bit of time with him. And I think I got him a little worried when I started asking about arson on a boat. So he wasn't sure, but he answered all my questions. So it was a combination of, to answer the question, firsthand knowledge and research and going there and seeing how it's done.
Thank you. So for Chris, you and Bob Crane wrote a book about Jack Nicholson. It's hard to imagine Nicholson opening up to anyone. How did you get your foot in that door?
This is a long story. I was in a film class at the University of Southern California, taught by a fellow named Stephen Karp, who he was a screenwriter and had one big hit with Michael Douglas, whose title escapes me. But the class was called The Film Heroes of the 30s and 60s. So for my thesis, this was the 70s. My thesis, I decided that I wanted to write about antihero, the antihero in film, which was kind of a new thing. And I landed on Nicholson because I had just seen Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces had just come out, and I was blown away by this guy. I said, who is this guy and why don't I know anything about him? And I discovered that he'd made 25 movies prior to making Easy Rider. He'd written films, he'd produced films. And so I went to the professor and I said, I want to do my thesis on Jack Nicholson and I'm going to interview him. And Nicholson, who's notoriously publicity shy and never done a talk show to my knowledge, he said, you're going to interview him? And I said, yeah. And he said, yeah, good luck with that. And off I went. So through one connection or another, I was given a phone number. And the fellow that gave me the number didn't know what the number was. He said, it might be his agent. It might be his manager. I have no idea, but I have this number in my Rolodex for him. And by that point, my buddy Bob and I had joined forces to do this. And I said, well, all right, let's call this number. I said, here, you do it. You know, it's like, Mikey will lead it. But so Bob dialed the number. He's standing on his wall phone and I was listening. And when the phone picked up at the other end, it was very obviously Jack Nicholson. And it's kind of odd to say, is Jack Nicholson there when you know you're talking to Jack Nicholson? So Bob just launched into the spiel about we're film students. We were doing a paper about the whole 30s and 60s and anti-hero, and we'd like to interview you. And Jack said, well, yeah, but I'm just about to start another movie and it's going to have to wait a little while. And so we said, no problem, whenever you can do it. And that's how it happened. And when he finished that film, which was The King of Marvin Gardens, which he did with Bruce Dern and directed by Bob Rafelson, who just died, and Ellen Burstyn. And when he finished that, we called him when the filming was over, and he said, well, come on up. And he lived up on Mulholland Drive, which is this long, windy road that runs along the spine of the Santa Monica Mountains. And it's a beautiful, beautiful drive, and it divides Los Angeles proper from the San Fernando Valley. And in those days, this was 1972. So in those days, there weren't electric gates, there wasn't intercom at the gate, there was just this dirt driveway off of Mulholland Drive, and there were 3 houses on this little road. The first house on the left was Marlon Brando's, and then Jack Nicholson's house, and another house that Jack owned that he was renting to an actress named Helena Kallianotis, who was the hitchhiker in 5 Easy Pieces. The one who says, oh, it's all crap. And so she was living there. And we pull up, and as we get out of the car and go to walk to the front door, Michelle Phillips comes out the front door. And I guess Jack was dating her at the time. And we said, we're here to interview Jack. And she said, oh yeah, go on, right in. And we looked at each other and we said, we're in a different world. This is a different world. So we sat down with him, we talked film for hours and hours. And that was how it started. And then when we left, we were so excited, I almost killed us on Mulholland Drive driving off the road. But other than that, it was just an auspicious and wonderful beginning. That was the beginning of the book.
So we have a question actually for both of you, which is, and I'll let Diane go first. So my question, or the question posed, is what have you been inspired by recently, in terms of what have you read recently that has moved you? So I know that's a loaded, hard question. No pressure. Here's Diane.
I'm going to tell the truth. I'm a writer and I don't read very much. What have I read recently? Miss Benson's Beetle was a good one. It didn't inspire me. I didn't start writing, but it was a good book until it wasn't, but it was mostly a good book. I don't know what inspired me. I really don't. I don't know where the short story came from that started the novel. I do remember coming up with the first sentence about Alice being a raw-boned woman. I don't remember where I heard the word raw-boned, but I remember I wrote that down. And that's all I remember about how I got the first sentence to the short story. And then the story, and then subsequently the book. I don't want to say it wrote itself, but that didn't happen. It took 10 years, but every once in a while I get an idea and I'd write it down, and eventually I pieced it together. Right now I'm trying to get inspired, although Chuck Close says inspiration is for sissies. So I don't know what I'm waiting for, but it just gels. I don't know that there's an actual moment of inspiration. Not for me. I can't speak for other writers or artists, but one day you just feel like doing it. And sometimes it's a word, sometimes it's someplace you go. Other times you can't finger it. You don't know where it comes from. So I hope that answered the question. Thank you.
I don't know that I draw inspiration from other writers so much. Lately, I've been reading a lot of Kate Atkinson, who is an English writer, and she's mostly known for writing mysteries. But I'm reading a book of hers at the moment that is a very interesting construction, in that the book takes place over many years, but with different things happening that change the whole course of events during the 30s and 40s in England, prior to World War II and then during the war. And the way she constructs both her mysteries and this book is inspiring to me, just because it's so interesting to see a writer put these pieces together. But for pure emotional inspiration, I draw from being outside, being in nature, and seeing, my wife and I are birders, and we've spent a lifetime traveling the world looking for birds and animals in their natural habitats. And that's what really inspires me, is being out in the in nature. And the story that's in the collection, Hunting License, has a lot of that. It's all it's based on the Black Rock Forest, which is just up here along the river, and half an hour up the river. Although setting is not maybe further north, but it's inspired in me from the Black Rock Forest. So that's where I draw my inspiration from.
Yes, we have another question here in our audience.
To piggyback to Diane, you've worked in the art world for quite some time, and I wonder if that work and those experiences have ever inspired you to write about that particular field, that particular in the world.
So the question from the audience is how Diane's experience in the art world has also perhaps informed, maybe directly or indirectly, her current experience now. Yes?
I don't know how I could have forgotten that as regards my inspiration, but thank you. Yes, I'm, they're very much connected, I think. I sort of at one point many years ago pretty much stopped making visual art, and I started writing just for myself, a poem here and there or a story, but I feel they're very much connected. Farron, the protagonist in the book, is an artist, and that's one thing I think that did come from me. I didn't model him directly after me as far as the type of work he did, but I really liked writing about an artist, and I knew a lot about being an artist. And it also worked the other way around. When I was writing the book, I got really into parts where I think I said earlier, where I was describing the setting and the scenery, or, you know, the sense of place. And there were times I felt more like I was painting than I was writing. It really, I can't describe how good those moments were. At those times, the words just came, and it felt like, wow, I'm painting again. That's exactly what it felt like.
Just to add to that, I don't mean to interrupt, but I
Mhm.
think that's the finger on the Diane, in fact, that
Did?
your writing is very visual.
Mm.
For me, I mean, it was very visual. But all your descriptions.
Thank you.
And as you said, it, you drew it from your, brought it in from your drawings that you've done, or from your artwork.
Mhm.
And so it was a visual picture for me, because I'm very visual. Like it all. But that's I think that's key for you. Work together.
It did, and it took me by surprise, because it wasn't until I was, well into the book and probably on the final draft where I realized that that was happening. It was a great feeling to feel like I was painting this book.
It sounded like they were painting with words.
That's what it felt like. It's the only way I could describe it. So, I mean, and I'm glad to hear it came across to other people have said that it feels very visual to them. So that was good.
So we want to thank everybody for their time today. We will be posting this on YouTube, as we said, and we'll follow up with all of you. And we'll continue a little discussion here, I think, in person, but we want to thank everybody in Zoom land for joining us as well. And we want to thank Diane and Chris for presenting their works to us today and sharing a bit of themselves. It's been really quite a lovely afternoon. So thank you all.